the session that we're going to be talking about now is evaluation approaches for measuring systems change at scale. As some of you might be knowing, that Breakthrough has also, as we work on deep transformation, we also work at a systems change level at a scale, right? And we're going to be talking about how have we been measuring that and how have we been working at that scale. So please join me in welcoming our panel for today. I'm honored to have an exceptional panel for this. Please welcome Dr. Priya Rampal, Senior Consultant, Quantitative Lead at Oxford Policy Management. Mihir Mathur, Founder Director at DESTA Research LLP. We've got Lipsa Bharti, Deputy Director, Partnerships and Learning at Transform Schools. And finally, we have Animesh Sharma, Head of Evaluations at Breakthrough, who would also be moderating today's panel. Over to you, Animesh.
This is essentially around evaluation approaches that we can potentially look at when we look at systems change programs. I'll just give you like a brief overview of how and why did we think of putting this as a panel. So Breakthrough has been working on systems change program primarily in 2 states of India, Odisha and Punjab. And we look forward to getting to other states of India. Based on our experience, we've also seen that how different systems change programs can be from the conventional direct intervention-based programs. So while there is a realization at that end, that in terms of the design, the programs can be very different, there's also a realization that the evaluation approaches also need to be extremely different for systems change programs. And while we were looking at what kind of best practices are there with respect to evaluation, we thought it would be good to get experts who've been working in this field and learn from them in terms of what have been their learnings with respect to evaluating systems change program, and particularly if we could learn from them about the challenges and the best practices. Before we get into the questions, I feel that it would be good to also acknowledge that systems change programs in general, there's been a sudden surge in the number of systems change programs, or in general, the investment in systems change programs of late. And this has been primarily post-COVID. We see COVID as like a point of inflection in a certain sense, that how COVID-19 has exposed the weaknesses that were there in the structure, be it the health system, be it the education system, be it the social security system. So in a certain sense, COVID-19 has shown us the mirror in a certain sense. And as a result of this, we are looking at greater investments in strengthening the systems instead of looking at very piecemeal kind of projects which are largely aimed at service delivery. Here we are looking at more and more investments which are addressing the more fundamental problems and are looking at strengthening the systems. Apart from that, one more change that we see in the last 3-4 years is probably there's a better realization in terms of when we look at the major problems that face us, that those problems actually do not occur in isolation. So when we talk about climate change, we talk about gender, we talk about migration, we talk about health. In a certain sense, all these problems are interrelated. And as a result of this, there is a need to probably not look at these problems in isolation, but probably look at them in a more holistic manner. And as a result of that, we see more and more investment in systems change programs. And while we look at this, we definitely feel that there is a greater need for us to deep dive into what kind of measures do we really need to look at what kind of impacts are generated through these programs, what kind of outcomes are generated through these programs. So with this, we'll start the panel. I'll go to Mihir first. Given that Mihir has worked extensively in systems change, I felt that for the group, for the audience, it might be useful for us to take a step back and understand in general, how do we see systems? Like, what is a system? If you could probably explain that first, and then we could look at what does system change mean, and particularly in context of social development programs.
Thank you very much. This is like a classroom question. What is a system? That's what I typically start my class with. Let me say this for professionals in the working space. Systems are imaginary, right? Systems are imaginary. COVID-19 started as a medical problem. But did it end as a medical problem? It did not. It became a social economic problem. It became a management challenge. So while we define systems as medical systems, economic systems, social systems, the real world doesn't work like that, right? So systems are imaginary. We make systems just to manage them well. And I think that is a bit of a problem. The boundary condition of systems create a lot of problems. A lot happens on the boundary. So we are sitting at IIC, but does IIC have a very finite boundary? It does not. Different people walk into IIC, walk out of IIC, right? The IIC itself has adjacencies. So when we talk about systems, you have to talk about adjacencies. The system gets impacted by its external environment and a lot that is happening on the boundaries. So systems in that sense are imaginary, but to give you a textbook definition, a system is actually made up of the interconnection of the parts. Unfortunately, we have gained expertise to understand the parts. We have specialists and super specialists who understand a lot about the parts, but we don't spend enough time in understanding how the parts interact with each other. Think about your family. What creates the mood in the family? Sometimes you love each other, sometimes you hate each other. Is it because of one actor in the family? No. It is because of the interactions between the actors. You change the nature of the interactions between the actors, and the quality or the emergent outcome of the family as an experience will change, right? So why don't we manage our cities like that? Why do we say that, city, traffic is number one problem, let's fix traffic and cities will be better? Unlikely. Unlikely. So we say systems are complicated, complex. They are made up of interacting parts. If you don't understand the interactions, you will struggle to manage systems. Anyways, because systems are imaginary also. So that's what it is. And second part also answer now or later.
In a certain sense, like why systems change you feel are more important, particularly in context of social development problems?
Because in social systems, though, you can't even define the boundary. Very hard to define a boundary. We were doing a project on railway children, right, with a foundation. And as we started mapping the system and the complexities, we realized most of the children who end up coming to railways come because of problems of domestic violence. And the same foundation was also running a program separately on domestic violence, for which the workshop was supposed to happen 2 days later. But then in the workshop on railway children, we started mapping domestic violence. So even for philanthropists to give funding, it is very complicated for social systems. How do you separate them? You can't, right? And straight from domestic violence, you go to say educating girl child and early marriage. And then, hey, we were talking about railway children, but. So social systems, defining systems and boundaries is difficult, but still it has to be done. That is the painful part. So how do we do it with little more mindfulness and being more aware of the problems we'll enter into is something time has come for us to acknowledge and start practicing.
Sure. Thanks, Mihir. I would now want Lipsa, if you could come in, particularly based on your experience in terms of designing and implementing a systems change program at Transform School. I feel it would be good if you could give a broad overview based on your experience. What all considerations do you usually have when you're designing and implementing a systems change program? And particularly if you could draw a contrast between a systems change program and a direct implementation program. In general, what kind of differences do you see when we look at designing and implementing such programs?
Thank you for asking that question. I'll build on what Mihir is talking about, that systems are imaginary, but they have real people at the helm of them and real people as part of it. and real people constantly negotiating the question, what is really a system and what is my system? The point I'm trying to make is that systems change is as much change as it is partnership with people within the system. We've all seen the inverted triangle of doing systems transformation, starting at a structural level, moving to relational level, and finally looking at a mindset level. That's the toughest to do. Now, I haven't met a state level officer in my education career for last 7 years who doesn't have the heartburn of not having institutionalized something, not having done enough good when they were at a district posting. Only last week, we were talking to Director SCRT of Government of Tripura, where it's a World Bank funded project for systems transformation of SCRT and DITES. And together we were talking about what beyond the time period of this project. Am I really strengthening the system beyond this project or not? The point I'm trying to make is that a lot of systems change work has to build on the intention of the champions who exist within the system. That is, I think, a beginning design principle of how we do look at systems change. The second part of systems change, again borrowing from Mihir, is how do you see the imaginary, if it is imaginary, and almost the moral burden of the practitioner to see the imaginary and build integration within what is actually imaginary in nature. So in Odisha and Karnataka, we run at-scale learning programs for classes 6 to 10th, and it's been a proven program. It improves learning gains by a certain 1.5 years from just 50 hours of instruction. So we've been able to break it down into levers of what that change is, starting with buy-in with the state that learning has to be targeted in nature and therefore you need resources for it, moving to running a full year program. Now systems are very good, government systems are very good at running mission mode programs. That's why elections work so well in our country. Everybody knows how to handle an election because it happens once in 5 years, very short time bound and high energy. But education is not like that. Education requires the teacher to show up every day for 200 working days. So how do you hold a system momentum for the entire year? So just being able to run full year programs itself, I think, is systems change in that sense. Third lever for us for this has been, how do you build capacity of state institutions to be able to create high quality resources for teaching and learning? Now, I would contrast Odisha and Karnataka. In Odisha, we've been there for 5 years. There are very strong teacher groups who now know how to create resources. In Karnataka, we have been there for 1 year, where the SCERT and the DIETS have taken the ownership of creating resources, but the quality has a long way to go. Now, these two lie at a certain spectrum of systems change maturity. How do we see it in that nuance for systems change is very, very important for us. The third example in seeing the system is also looking at interdepartmental convergence that comes with systems change. In Odisha, for the longest time, only government schools were part of our programs, whereas the tribal department also runs schools, and government-aided schools are almost the same number as government schools. So being able to stitch convergence across multiple, often conflicting interdepartmental dynamics and being able to align on a common agenda is another design principle for us to look at systems change. The third piece is how important research and evidence building is towards the effort of systems change. And it's great that we are sitting in a convening which launched the report of what was done in Jharkhand, because it's only in research and evidence that we are able to bring in the intersectional lenses, the lens of looking at social norms and power dynamics, that ultimately one gets the ammunition to discuss with system stakeholders about it. There's a study we did with the SR Center in 2018 on access and transition, which talked about how the reasons for why girls and boys drop out are different, and how even when boys drop out, they have life choices, whereas when girls drop out, they are ending up doing household chores. So if this is a critical input of what reality is, how do we take it back to the system stakeholder and design programs which are able to target probably vulnerability support for dropout differently for boys and girls? There's another data point that we saw in Odisha after 6 years of programming, that teachers less than 5 years of experience and more than 10 years of experience were not performing as well as teachers within the 5 to 10 year band. There is a Goldilocks tenure of years, probably when the teacher is not too young, not too old, has the motivation. Now, this insight is something that we're going to take back to the state system and look at how do you have differentiated teacher professional development programs. And therefore, data becomes very, very important when we are looking at something like this. We also saw in one study where girls were not attending as much classes, but their gains were higher. Now, what does that mean for a teacher working with the students and for us to program and ensure their participation improves over time? Is there a time check or I can speak more?
No, you can.
Okay, great. I have a couple of more points. The fourth point is about what the performance session just before this. Why did it make so much sense in a convening that's talking of shifting norms? Because everybody is looking for meaning. And I'm talking about reform communications becoming a very important part of systems change, because the person who's acting also needs to meaning make what are they really doing. Otherwise, we're often moving the system towards a bunch of activities which happen at very high speed. ऊपर से order आया, notification आया, इसको करवा दिया, teachers training करवा दिया, classroom में भी observation हो गया. But unless we shift narrative of what did we really do, what did we really achieve, and build a common language of talking about what we are doing with each other within the system. Again, an example of what we're doing in Tripura. We just finished training 15,000 teachers in a record 2 months time period, and even the trainings were of a very different quality, where they were able to appreciate the subject, the nature of subject, rather than trainings just being very ready to use type of trainings. But I think what we are still struggling with and what we need to build in that field is to bring everyone to a common language within the next 1 month or so. For the entire 1 year, what have we really done? And it is from that common language will there be narrative shifts and will there be new meanings made, and that's how systemic shifts is something that sustains. In November of 2024, we launched something called the State of Secondary Education Collaborative, and the inaugural convening was in London, and we had Breakthrough's participation as well. So Noyana had told us something while preparing for it, that while you're building this collaborative, remember that adolescents are not instruments of future. They have needs in the here and now. And that statement almost became the primary reason why we had an adolescent track in the collaborative. And as we are building this collaborative into becoming a systems change orchestrator, we are keeping that in mind. The reason why I'm talking about this collaborative is that sometimes practitioners do not just have the burden of running programs. We might have to step back from the programmatic lens of practice into really looking at narrative practice of enabling systems change. And that is what the State of Secondary Education aims to be able to do. Catalyze reform evidence investment and practice across global South countries towards secondary education. Because secondary education is seen, there is proof enough research to say completing secondary education leads to reducing poverty, leads to societal harmony, leads to intergenerational outcomes on health and nutrition as well. So that these are some design principles of looking at systems change and even redefining what programming could mean for a practitioner's perspective.
Sure. Thanks. This is very enlightening. I think you've touched upon some of very important aspects that one needs to take into consideration when designing a program. And you rightly mentioned that one of the aspects which is extremely important is that how do you learn from data, and particularly what role would your monitoring and evaluation play in that. That brings me to Dr. Priya. Priya, if you could throw some light. Now, we'd want to dive deep into this, and I think there's nobody better than Priya on this. So if you could throw some light in terms of, if you to go into specifics, that if you to look at evaluation approaches, how are evaluation approaches for a systems change program different from a direct intervention? And specifically, if you could maybe talk about the kind of frameworks that we would use in a systems change program, what kind of designs would you want to use there? And subsequently, what kind of, how would it influence in terms of the nature of tools that you use or the kind of indicators that you would frame when evaluating a systems change program?
Thank you, Animesh. So there's a lot of pressure to come in after the practitioners, but as an evaluator, you have to maintain a certain degree of equanimity and try not to get too biased. So you need to have that unbiased view when you get into it. So going into the easier question first, the difference between a direct implementation program and a systems evaluation. So the very fact is that their goals are different. They want to see different impacts. So, for instance, a direct implementation can be something that the government wants to do. It probably wants to increase the number of students who are enrolled in schools. So that's just it. They just want to see higher numbers. But when you talk about a system evaluation, then you look at not just the students enrolled in school, but their attendance, the number of teachers, the teacher to student pupil ratio that would be there in the school, the quality of the classroom, and facilities that are available in the school. For instance, even sanitation, because a lot of dropouts happen because there are not no proper facilities in the school. So all of these then in that whole system become integrated. So that in a nutshell is where we see the difference. Other than that, when we talk about indicators, then like I said, the indicator for a direct program would be just number of students enrolled, and there would be indicators for a systems change, which would be the attendance also of this teacher, number of teachers in the school, teachers going to school, how often are they going, student enrollment, student attendance, student learning levels. So you actually deep dive into that. And facilities in the school, number of classrooms, quality of the classrooms. Do they have a blackboard? Are chalks available? If there are whiteboards, are pens, proper pens available? So all of these things. And not to forget, as I mentioned, drinking water and toilet. These should be there in the school. So you look at that in totality, because you cannot just increase the number of students in a school if there is, these facilities are not there. So in that sense, a system evaluation takes that broader picture into account. So you also start thinking from what are the factors that you want to, what are the problems? So contextual factors that are there. So what exactly is the problem? What is the kind of intervention that is needed in this area? And is it relevant? So now very seamlessly, I'll try to move on to the framework. So there is a Development Assistance Committee framework, the OECD DAC criteria, which talks about so it talks about relevance. That is what we are proposing. The intervention, is it relevant? Is it going to take care of the problems that are affecting a particular community or a particular region? So next there is coherence. Coherence is the interconnectedness. What are already the existing programs in that community? If the intervention that we are offering, is it really making a difference, or it doesn't matter? There are already existing programs there. Next is effectiveness, where you want to look at so what is it exactly that you want to see changed? So if it is about learning outcomes of the children, then will you see an effect there? So then going to efficiency, how are the inputs in the program changing into outputs? Basically, is the resource allocation right in the program? And finally, to the impact. So impact just not on the learning levels, there would also be all the indicators that I spoke about. So for instance, attendance, enrollment, all of those indicators. So effectiveness would in fact encompass all of these secondary outputs or outcomes, and final impact you could see on the learning level. So this is the DAG criteria. Now, in terms of the frameworks that we have, usually in any evaluation, and particularly in a systems evaluation, you first try and develop a theory of change. And there you link it with this DAC criteria that I spoke about. So in the theory of change, also the thinking starts from the problem. What is the problem? Students are not, say, going to school. So if students are not going to school and that is the problem, then you think about why are they not going to school? So you have a problem statement, then you have the input. So what can we do so that they go to school? So first you have a school, have it with the basic facilities. So there should be a fan, there should be a classroom, there should be toilets, water, of course a teacher, and then learning material. So even though directly if you think about it, when I'm learning, it's not that I need drinking water. Like if I'm learning, I need a teacher, I need a copy, and I learn. But all of these things also come into the picture. So these all should be a part of this. So these would be the inputs, and what would the outputs then be? That more children are coming to school. So this is the whole theory of change like this, starting with the problem, going to the inputs, the outputs, and those finally, getting into the short-term outcomes, which would be more children going to school, and then ultimately impact, where we see that learning levels of the children have improved. So this is in a nutshell, the theory of change linked to the DAC criteria, which I spoke about earlier. And this is how you start thinking about the whole system. I have 2 more minutes. So when you so this is how you think about evaluating the program. And finally, in a systems change, so it is also more long term. Therefore, you want to see a change in policy ultimately. So not just you want to see increased learning levels. And while you are at it, while you are evaluating, if there are any learnings that you get from the program, then you also try and incorporate them in your tool or the questionnaire that you develop to control for all of these things, not just the input, all of these. So input, output, outcomes. So you want to, whatever you are learning. So for instance, some children may say that there is no electricity in the school, it's very hot. So you understand then that is another issue. So you can go back and tell the implementing partner that this is one issue. So if you could resolve it, perhaps there's a power cut daily at the same time, maybe change timing. So such things, that adaptive approach is something that is also needed here. So with that, I'll pass on to you, Animesh, and happy to come back.
Thank you so much. I think it kind of takes us back to where we started from, that how evaluation for systems change program needs to be much more holistic than any direct intervention kind of a program. Also, like you mentioned, that if, let's say, you're talking about education, there'd be so many other variables which would impact the education outcomes, which it is very easy for us to ignore them or not give them the due importance they deserve while evaluating the programs. And essentially, when we look at defining a system, or let's say in this context, if you're defining an education system, then we definitely need to take into consideration all those variables which can possibly influence our ultimate outcomes. And as a result of that, we need to figure out a way of incorporating them within our evaluation framework. That how do we capture data around each of those aspects so that we know at a broader level how well the system is working. Thank you so much. This also brings me to another very interesting aspect of systems change programs, that if I were to just directly compare a systems change program with a direct implementation kind of a program, there is definitely, especially when you're operating at scale, there is definitely a loss of control in a certain sense. If, for instance, if I were to give you an example, if let's say we are working with schools of a particular district versus if, let's say, we are working across all government schools of a particular state, for us to operate at that scale, it would definitely mean that the kind of control we would want to have in our intervention, we would definitely have to let go of that control to a certain extent. And what essentially we usually do in such circumstances is that we identify certain levers which we feel would work effectively for us. And then we invest our energies, our efforts, our resources on those levers. And then we have a certain degree of trust that once we work on those levers, these levers would in turn work and would create a certain kind of outcome and impact eventually. So that brings me to the point that when you have, there is a certain degree of reduction in the kind of control you have on not only outcomes and impact, but also in terms of the way you intervene, the way you conduct your activities, there would definitely be a number of unintended outcomes. So Mihir, I would want you to throw some light on this, that I see that if I were to look at these two different approaches, definitely the scope and importance of unintended outcomes would be much higher in a systems change program. So how do you think we could take those into consideration when we're evaluating such programs? And also, I feel like it's also very important at the time of evaluation to intentionally measure the different intersectionalities that may occur in the program. So and essentially that's whatever that we can do at our end to ensure that the program that we're running is inclusive in nature. So broadly on these two aspects, if you could throw some light, that how do we look at incorporating a way in which we can measure unintended outcomes and also intentionally measure the intersectionalities?
So, well, there are no unintended outcomes. There are outcomes that we fail to conceive. So we call them unintended. Okay. So there are just outcomes and outcomes, some which we could think, some which we could not. So it is completely our failure. So we have to overcome that failure. How do we do that? Not at the time of evaluation, but at the time of designing. Okay? Because if you think about it at the time of evaluation, it is too late. So at the time of designing, theory of change, what we do now with organizations is we say, don't design a theory of change. Think about designing a systems theory of change. So you start mapping the system, then figure out, slice it, saying, okay, this is too complex. We neither have the resources nor the money. So we are going to pick up a substantial portion of this and I'm going to work on that. And that's where you also draw a boundary. And then you become aware that these things are my first order effects, direct. And then there could be second order, third order effects, which may not be inside our project, but they will impact our project. So that is your first way of reducing your blindness. What are unintended consequences? Unintended consequences are a reflection of our degree of blindness. That's what unintended consequences are. So your job is to reduce your degree of blindness. That is the intervention. At the design stage, and then again at the M&E stage. Now, second, we are dealing with living dynamical systems. Okay? Dynamical systems means systems change over time. With your intervention, without your intervention. If systems are changing over time, you also need to learn and adapt. So that brings us to the question of agile management of the program itself, not just of M&E. We call it MLE, monitoring, learning and evaluation. But the program also needs to learn, adapt, change over its duration. So you have a 4-year program. I would suggest iterate, change your design based on what you're learning from the ground every year. Okay? You have to adapt to the program and the reality. Okay? That's number 2. Number 3, you will still fall short. So you have to build peace by saying that we will not be able to account for all unintended consequences. It is not possible. Okay? Real world systems are way too complex for human cognition. So be humble. The starting point is we are always wrong. We are always wrong. How to be less wrong? That is the pursuit. Okay? How to be less wrong? How to make choices which are less wrong? How to be aware of the unintended consequences which we may create, and then develop contingency plans for that. So it's actually de-risking strategy. Okay? Part of impact creation is also de-risking, which we don't always do, but it is very important to do. And systems change from the inside, not from the outside. As much as we may think because of our project the system has changed, the system accepted our interventions and it chose to change. That's why changes happened. So systems change from the inside, not from the outside. Okay? COVID-19 happened. Everybody got the virus. Different people responded to it differently. What happened there? The human system, the biology and the body responded differently to the virus. The social system, the medical system also responded differently to the virus. So it is the internal workings of the system which determine how the system changes and responds. Now comes the ultimate nail in the coffin for people who are working on systems change. Systems change is evident after change has happened. So you will always be late. Okay? Please build peace with that also. Systems change is evident in retrospect. And that is a problem. Not for system change, for us. Why? Because you are estimating impact all the time. But systems, complex systems have non-linearities, redundancies, emergent outcomes. It will go outside your boundary. So you'll realize after things have happened that, oh, this is what has happened. It may challenge your existing M&E framework. You need to adapt and change. Unlike problem solving, and I want to differentiate between problem solving and systems change. We are actually using the same method of problem solving and now calling it systems change. I'm sorry. That is what is happening around the world. and it is creating more problems for us. Okay? Problem solving is fixing parts. Okay? So in this room, we can problem solve. The computer connect nahi ho raha hai, you can solve it. The temperature is less, you can solve it. But that's problem solving. You're fixing parts. Systems change means you have to work on the interconnections in the system. That is not problem solving. That is reimagining systems. And systems have their own empowerment, whether you like it or not, to redesign themselves, self-organization. You can only facilitate. And that's where your controllability goes for a toss. I can redesign this thing, but I cannot use the same method to do social projects. It doesn't work like that. The system has an agency of its own. The system also has a redundancy of its own. So you may keep intervening, you will not see outcomes. Because the system has developed a redundancy towards your interventions. Okay? That also happens. So these are some of the challenges that you will face when doing systems change. So one, you have to build peace that there will be unintended consequences. Unintended consequences reflect your degree of blindness. So you have to work on that right from the design stage, not only at M&E stage. Your program has to adapt to the changing realities on ground because systems are dynamical. And your M&E also has to learn from the ground and keep changing its indicators as impact emerges. And systems change from the inside, not only from the outside.
Thanks. This is very interesting. You mentioned that systems are dynamic in nature. They keep changing, they keep evolving. Also, when we look at change, we always change is always measured retrospectively. So it's always happened and then we're late and then we're measuring. So, and at the same time, the systems in itself is also evolving, and hence there is a need to have an iterative approach to...
Yeah, one thing I would like to add, for problem solving, you can develop very knowable, measurable indicators. And you can be reasonably sure that these indicators will tell me if the problem is solved or not. For systems change, it's a little bit of guesswork.
Right.
That is also where the difference lies between the two.
Exactly. So actually, that is what I feel is very interesting, and that is what makes evaluation for systems change very complex. So at one end, the system in itself is very dynamic, and the other is that change is happening and we are measuring it retrospectively. And then there are changes in the interconnections that are happening within the system. So in a certain sense, one is changes happening, and then when you have to measure, even what you have to measure and how you have to measure will also keep changing. And as a result of that, your MEL framework also needs to be dynamic, also needs to keep incorporating the kind of changes that are happening in your system. So that I feel is a huge challenge, but is also a huge opportunity for MEL to kind of respond to. And that is where I think, Priya, I would bring you in, that how do you feel this entire challenge of the ever-changing system, how do you measure it? What are the approaches that you can use? And how do you keep your MEL system kind of iterative in a certain sense that keeps changing and also learning from itself?
Thanks, Animesh, and I completely agree with Mihir that we are blind. So starting from to some degree, yes, because we don't really understand. We think we do, but when we get into it, start designing the theory of change, and then also try and link it to the indicators upfront, without having gone to the field yet. Though we always try to, have an exposure visit, understand the program, and then start developing all of this. But you won't realize the real problems unless you are actually there and getting your hands dirty in some sense. But the best case that you can do earlier on is to have a mixed method approach. Make sure that you are incorporating both qualitative and quantitative methods, where you do some deep diving with a smaller sample, and for the quantitative, of course, where you need a more powered sample. So that is one thing that should be done. Other than that, it cannot be that you have an evaluation and you just go in the baseline and then go in the end line without being in touch with the program throughout. That just cannot be the case. So there has to be a monitoring, if possible, if budget allows, then there should be a midline, and if not, then certainly there should be some pockets of more qualitative deep dive work where you go and understand what are the kind of changes that are happening. Especially if I feel personally that focus group discussions are become a very important point there, because the more community engagement, the better the possibility of that program to be sustainable. And sustainability is what actually really will bring about that system change. That's only how the system will change. So having these points in the duration of the evaluation where you keep going on, not maybe for a full base end line or a mid line, but at least a small keeping in touch, making sure that we understand how things are changing. I'll also give an example of a program that we had conducted at Oxford Policy Management, an evaluation. So this was about improving birth weights of newly born children. And at baseline, data was collected. Of course, then when data is collected, sometimes the monitoring is not there. There were also other problems. This was just before the pandemic. So not enough, there could not be as many quality checks as we would have liked. So when we looked at the data, a whole bunch of children were at 2,500 grams and 3,000 grams, because that's how the weighing machine will weigh them. So there was no variability in the data. And then finally, how will you see the impact? There is no variability. So then we realized that this cannot work. So at end line, at midline, in fact, we decided that perhaps the best case would be to have digital weighing machines, and therefore we changed strategy. So we had a difference approach earlier. Then we did an end line only propensity score matching kind of a design. So these are the kind of things that pop up, and therefore, which also make us realize how important it is to monitor, to conduct all the quality checks. And sometimes when there is lockdown, then these things were not possible then. But what is the best case? What can we do then so that we can still evaluate the program? So that is another way to just keep on monitoring, seeing it, learning, and then making that change in the way we design, in the way we approach, and the kind of indicators that we really want to put in there. So one more thing that I want to just add is the bit of equity. So I spoke about the DAC criteria, and I didn't mention equity there, but equity is the most relevant there because it fits in everywhere. So we speak of it as GETSI, which is gender equality, disability, social inclusion. So making sure that any program, and particularly in India, everywhere in fact, but here, so socially vulnerable groups, disabled, and there is a gender balance. So if we are talking about the school survey, for instance, making sure that there is that right percentage of gender, and they are there in our sample of the people that we go to, because that's just a cross-cutting theme, cutting across at all levels, right from relevance, coherence, effectiveness, efficiency to the impact. Over to you, Animesh.
Thanks. Thank you so much. I think what I'm drawing from this particular piece is that it is a huge challenge for us to keep guessing how your system is changing, and then basis that how your evaluation and monitoring needs to kind of keep pace with the changing system. And the best way is to be as close with your system as possible. And qualitative, you mentioned, is a very important component here, that you get rich qualitative data, you get a broad understanding of how different actors are responding to your intervention, how the system is therefore then responding to the change. And also another thing is that the importance of monitoring, how frequently you can afford to be in the field, collect data, and get a broad sense of what's happening. So I think that kind of is very important to build an understanding in terms of how do you keep your MEL framework also fairly dynamic and in a way that it can kind of respond to the changes that are happening within the system. To just close the loop, I feel like because it's a very important component that we just figured out that how a system is dynamic. It's kind of changing every second, and basis that when you're measuring your outcomes, you retrospectively measure them, and then basis that you kind of get a sense of how do you want to keep your MEL framework also dynamic to respond to the changes in the system. At the same time, I feel that what is also important is to close the loop around this, that when you get this information, when you get the learnings from this ever-changing MEL system about an ever-changing system, what kind of mechanisms do you really need to draw learnings out of it? And I think that is where Lipsa, I would want you to come in, based on your experience in terms of implementing such a program, can you give examples in terms of how do you can we create a mechanism in terms of how do you draw learnings from this ever-changing MEL system, and how do you think this would feed into the program, and then how do we think that we can make sense out of it for us to make any changes in terms of the design or the way the program it's being implemented?
I want to talk about this distinctly, both in terms of direct implementation and at-scale program. But before that, I just want to rise from the coffin that Mihir put all of us practitioners into. So we have an innovations to scale practice where we stage gate and test innovations until they move to a threshold of impact and outcome, and then they are ready for scale. Now, we are aware that when we are designing for innovation, there are a lot of levers of systems change that we cannot affect simply because they are localized interventions and happening directly. But it's this innovation design itself which has the potential for maximum learning about the systems. Now, Sailesh over here was leading research for us for a new program that we are building called the Learning Equalizer. It integrates our proven learning program, adds gender awareness and life skills into it, and to be able to see what are the outsized gains that can be possible when you integrate these approaches. And we just did a need assessment of the theory of change for that particular program. People from Breakthrough like Sunita and Jatin have also kind of advised us on that. So certain learnings that we had from the need assessment, and it's an all-gender approach program. So Sailesh came with the insight that masculinities are not homogeneous in nature. That what is a boy is not a homogeneous singular identity. How do you then work with it? The second one was that what is required of a boy in terms of their identity is at loggerheads in terms of what is required for academic performance. Boys are supposed to be boisterous in nature, casual in nature, carefree in nature. But that's what hinders academic performance, which requires discipline and time-boundedness and all of that piece. The third insight that came from this was the positionality of a teacher affects who gets what kind of attention. It is the teacher's perception of the child in terms of what is their background, are they disciplined or not, are they coming from good families or not, that determines what kind of a response the teacher give to that particular child. Now, these are certain lessons that we are plowing back into the program, to first see how do we test the innovation knowing these are the realities. What part of it is probably that you can shift around this, which would require us to work with different stakeholders, and what part of it probably we cannot shift within an innovation context. But knowing this becomes very, very important, and therefore there's not so much distinction between direct implementation and at scale, as long as we use direct implementation as spaces for deep learning about what is really possible at scale. And the third feedback that we have been getting around this program is that when we're doing an all genders approach, how will you measure? Because what we realized from the need assessment is that no child identified themselves beyond the binary, right? And that could be probably because our measurement system did not create a safe space for the child to be able to identify for that matter. So we are also being pushed, and this is a vulnerable moment for us to realize, okay, we've embarked on an all-gender approach program, but how will we really move forward with it? And we understand probably our MEL systems have to evolve for helping us with the radical work that we all want to do. And that's something that we are at. The next piece I want to talk about is systems change to what outcome? It is true that systems change is evident after the change has happened. But for us to keep all stakeholders together, going on the momentum of why we are doing something, sometimes bringing that coherence of outcomes is also important, right? We might want to bring global focus on making secondary education a global minimum societal standard. Every child attains secondary school, but to what outcomes? This is where long-term research becomes very important, and as well as programmatic outcomes being socialized with system stakeholders becomes very important. For our learning program, what we are now trying to do with states is that bring states to a common understanding of what learning gains really are. Getting an adoption of the global metric of learning adjusted years of schooling as the common price around which all systems are supposed to be moving towards. And systems change needs to be tractable at a child level. Systems change can't be for the sake of systems change alone. So how do we move towards those outcomes and socialize those outcomes? And in the pursuit of this, we realize it's like peeling an onion. The more questions you ask, the more questions it will lead us to, and that is the nature of what reality is. And therefore, having strong learning systems per se. The last point I want to make, I think second last point, and this is something that I was having a lunch conversation with Pallavi, who's here from Dream a Dream, and she anchors their systems change work nationally, is that how do I build a team's ability to sense system shifts, or what kind of behaviors is required for a practitioner to be able to even create conditions of the systemic shift to happen. And she almost told that system work is like self work. You work on yourself, and it's from that space that system work is even possible. Right? So how do I build capacities in our distributed teams to be able to have conversations of a certain type, to be able to listen to stakeholders of a certain type in a certain manner, and then to be able to come and reflect back. So building this suite of very reflexive practices as well as deep listening practices, and almost shifting our own behaviors if the intention is to be able to enable systems change. And there was a question, there was a discussion on also, how do you shift donors towards funding for systems change as well, right? And what we have seen is every donor wants the change to be sustainable. They want to do something irreversible in terms of impacting the child's life. I think it's the burden of the practitioner to be able to cultivate shared vision about how do we really get there, what does it take. It's not an intent issue, it's a practice issue, and how do we therefore move towards it. And the last piece, I think, around systems change is we all know it's a very complex piece, and we are all blind men, women, and within the spectrum that we all agreed to being, trying to feel a part of an elephant and figuring out what part that is. I think socializing systems change victories once in a while in places like this becomes an important space of cross-learning within what are we even dealing with. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for specifically for this point of socializing the small victories that we get during the pathway. And I think that's particularly more important because systems change, we all know, is gradual in nature. And a lot of times you would essentially not know in which direction are you moving and whether you're moving at the right speed or not. So all the more important for the MEL to kind of be able to basically draw your attention towards how you're moving and to be able to capture small victories and then to be able to socialize it, to be able to share it with the different actors within the system and to be able to make meaning out of it. That once we've able to bridge a certain gap, no matter how small that is, what does it actually mean in the larger scheme of things? So thank you so much for throwing light on this. This has been a fairly enlightening session. I would just want to also draw a caveat here that in general, systems change, relatively speaking, has been a fairly like a nascent thing. It has come up very recently, if you to talk in relative sense. So in a certain sense, we all are learning. And even in terms of the people who've been working in this space, they're also trying to experiment a lot. They're trying to figure out what is working for them, what is not working for them. At the same time, I feel it is important for us to also share that there are no universal truths here. So it's not like whatever that has worked in the health system would definitely work in education system also. So I think that is what the other panelists were also trying to say. And I just felt that it's important to reiterate that that we're all learning, and all the panelists, whatever work that they've done in this space, the attempt through this discussion was to share their learnings, share what has worked for them, share the kind of challenges that they have faced, and the way that they were able to maneuver this space. So I'd like to thank all of them on behalf of everyone. But before that, if we have any questions for the panelists.
So I have this question for all the panelists, and anyone can kind of take this down. It was very exciting to hear your thoughts. But given the blinds and the educated guesses, are there any speculative strategies that have worked, and you know them to be best practices, that you would like to recommend to this room of practitioners?
So I can answer from the Mel perspective. So for designing the evaluation of the program, what we first do is a desk review to understand the secondary sources that have already deep dived and done some of the work, and then making sure that we have that literature review, all of those papers. So we try and map the TOC to all of that. So that's the step one. The second is that we go to an exposure visit and try and understand as best as we can. So from the evaluation side, these are the two things that we do for sure in order to make sure that we are, as less blind as possible to what we'll see in future. Do you want to add in?
No, I can. Do you want to add something?
No, I was just saying I'm feeling guilty of making people blind and putting them in coffin. I don't think I'll be invited again on a panel now. But yes, there are. If time permits, I'll show you something. You can actually identify indicators and information systems using methods of systems thinking and system dynamics modeling to identify what needs to be done, measured. You collect the information, put it back into a model, run the simulation model to better your guesstimate about the projected impact, and keep iterating this process. So there's a whole framework there, which we are developing and going to implement this year.
I'll just add one thing to this. I think from a systems change piece perspective, I think knowing what kind of systemic behaviors do we want to shift and having processes coded around enabling that. We have very strong quality assurance processes to ensure that full year programming happens, to ensure that classrooms have a certain quality, and that quality information comes back and gets discussed within the system as to what's really happening in the classroom. So I think that way, the program has to be programmed for systems change, and systems change and program cannot be really separate from each other.
Can I ask now? Yeah. Hi, my name is Siddharth. What we've seen, as you pointed out, that there are a lot of organizations, a lot of work is happening across systems change these days. We've seen, for example, in one of the states in Northeast where we work, we've seen 10 different organizations coming in at the same time, or maybe in 5 to 6 months, having their own monitoring evaluation ways, with talking with the same stakeholders in same schools, taking that time which is essential from their essential work which they are doing. At the same time, the same stakeholders are filling all that data for the government as well. So at a system level, I felt it's a big problem which is coming up, and would love to know how you think we can kind of take a shot at it.
Yeah. So I've been implementing systems thinking for different organizations. And after doing several projects, I realized that all those organizations are doing systems thinking separately. So then I thought, oh my God, are we implementing systems thinking in a non-systemic way? So I said, now another existential crisis. So a new venture which I'm starting is called Systems for Systems Change. It may sound a mouthful, but there is a reason why I'm saying this. People often forget to see themselves as systems. We are too busy modeling systems as separated objects from us. That is not true. That is not true. You can't do that anymore. You cannot model subjects saying, wo wahan pe, main yahan pe. It's not happening. We are a system now. So a pedagogy we developed is called systems convening, where coalition members walk into a room. We make them think of themselves as a system, We map it, we position ourselves into that and say, where am I? Do I see my work linking with yours? Are there co-benefits? Are there trade-offs? Most likely there might be trade-offs, as also what you pointed out. So it is very important to do this, because I have heard many organizations whom I've consulted saying we are doing systems change. And I walk back from their office to my hotel and I'm thinking, oh my God, now I'll walk into another office tomorrow and they'll say they are doing systems change. But now I see them happening separately and I'm freaking out. So what do we do? So we say now that we need systems for systems change. Just systems thinking alone by itself in isolation is not enough.
Hi, I'm Mahima. I work with the Emily team at the Gates Foundation, and we work a lot on systems change work, working at scale, etc. And so this is more a question to the evaluators on the panel. Right? We recently wrapped up an evaluation of a convergence program between Manrega and NRLM schemes, and the intervention was at systems level to a great extent. And some of the things we learned is how important it is to sort of stop thinking about only measurable outcomes, but look at, do a more thorough systems analysis, do a more rigorous process tracing, what is leading to what, investigate the relationships, the politics of it, also look at the competing interests of the different parties, etc. But as evaluators, we are exceedingly drawn towards traditional impact evaluation program designs, but in a systems change program, a TOC collapses very fast. Do you have examples of designs beyond the traditional baseline endline thinking with some tokenism of qual work done? From our experience, we have an example of adaptive evaluation that Imago wrapped up recently for us. But just wondering of more comprehensive designs that you have come across or used to really analyze a very complex systems change.
Sure, thank you. Thanks for the question. So I'll also link something from the previous question here. So there is an organization that we are working with, basically the program is installing solar panels. Now there is an umbrella organization and there are a lot of local NGOs under them. So in the Northeast particularly, that particular umbrella organization is bringing all the local NGOs that are involved together. So to some sense, it is bringing that coherence there. So in the same program, while it is solar panels, and I'm giving just an example because that's what I think you also asked. So this particular intervention, though they are installing solar panels, it's not very straightforward because the intervention, the solar panel can be used in agriculture, animal husbandry, textiles, food processing, and even photocopy shops. So it is that complicated. So there is no one way, to see impact. Perhaps you can see impact on increasing incomes, but the kind of costs, or if you want to say, if decreased drudgery, if it is the case of animal husbandry or agriculture, but it won't be very straightforward because the costs are different, the interventions are different. So here, though there is the plan of a baseline, midline, and end line to keep in touch, but there is a rigorous qualitative, particularly case studies in each of these. So we go back, we have stories of change, case studies, key informant interviews with beneficiaries. Not just them. Now, when there is a solar panel, when we think of a system, it cannot just be in isolation, right, to the beneficiary. So there are the technology partners. Then there is the organization, which is the umbrella organization, and the local NGOs. So there are interviews in place with all of these players in that full system. So if we think about it, in terms of increased income, there may not be, particularly because it is so complicated in the sense that each of the livelihood sectors is different. But when you think about, say, decreased drudgery or how technologically sound they have become, do they know how to clean the solar panels? If they've been given a machine, if it is related to, say, milling, are they able to, know what are the kinds of inputs that they put in? So increased knowledge. So all of those things, which I spoke about in the TOC, in the outcomes, those become as relevant here. And the qualitative aspect becomes even more relevant because if someone asks me what is the comparison between, say, the different livelihood sectors, then that Subsample will not probably be powered enough to give you a quantitative impact to that. But when you look at these deep, the stories of change or the qualitative research and going back and talking to these people, then that gives you more insights. Particularly, so they also have egg incubators. Then there are differences in the geography because the same program is in the Northeast and in Karnataka. So temperature differences and such small things also matter because of such changes in geography. So all of these then become those learnings which in fact you will never get in an impact evaluation. You can only get them when you deep dive and do the qualitative throughout, especially. So thanks.
Yeah. I found what Mihir said very intriguing, and that's the question here. You said we tend to misunderstand problem solving with system change. And system change, basically you're reimagining the system, right? So we generally don't see such a reimagination happening that often or very rarely. So when we are saying, in fact, are we changing system, chipping away at the old system by solving one problem at a time to create a new system? Is it how actually is happening? Just
Yeah, it's we are fixing parts. We are fixing parts and then hoping that the system will change. I think that's where the difficulty is. Now, one thought which was integrated systems. So our project is very integrated, 14 verticals. But all those 14 verticals are operating separately. So while you're doing biodiversity conservation and you're trying to enhance livelihoods, is biodiversity conservation contributing to enhancing livelihoods? That is the interconnection between the two verticals. But that might not feature into an M&E. You might measure the number of biodiversity training programs and the number of new livelihoods created. But what about the intersectionality and the contribution between the two? That is where I feel systems change. So you have to improve those interconnections in the system. And back to her point, what she asked, I think indicators have to be dynamic. You can't deal with static indicators. For example, response time. That's a phenomenal indicator, especially for climate resilience. Does the community have the adequate response time in comparison to the disaster strike rate, for example? So how can you develop a response time? You can do a number of trainings. Unfortunately, when it comes to M&E, we end up measuring the number of trainings conducted. Yeah. Does that correspond to a reduction in response time of the community? We think of proxy indicators. Why? Because it's easier to do. We have to get out of that comfort zone. So you also need information systems which can give you the right information about the indicator. So we're just developing indicators, but we're not developing information systems. So that is also some work what needs to be done.
Great. Thank you so much. I think this was a very enlightening session. I'm sure we all take back a lot of information around systems change and evaluation of systems change. And as I mentioned earlier, that this is a very nascent field and we're all learning, we're all experimenting. And that's what the panelists are also have been mentioning, that the things that they've mentioned, these are the aspects that have worked for them. And they've also tried to share the kind of challenges that they've faced during this journey. But the idea is that for us to draw learnings from them and then to also contextualize to the kind of geographies that we are working in, the kind of programs that we've designed, and then see to what extent we can actually apply those learnings or to what extent do we need to tweak them. So thank you so much for taking out your time. Thank you.